Thank you very much. This is my first trip to India. I live in New York. I am delighted to be here. I am flattered to have been invited. I have one favor to ask you all, if I may. I have children. My children are pretty young, 8 and 7, and they get the concept of travel. We have many Indian friends in New York, but India itself is abstract, very far away. The time difference is very confusing, so I'm going to talk to them on Skype later today, and I want to take a picture of you all to show them what I've been doing. So if you would, say cheese. All right, some people were not smiling. Try again, cheese. Okay, thank you very much. That will make the family understand where I've been. The topic today, can ideas change the world? The answer is, of course they can. That's what ideas are meant to do. But I'd like to posit a little bit more specific answer to that question, and maybe a slightly radical answer to that question. And the answer would be that often the ideas that change the world best are not big, complex, long unfolding ideas, but simple ideas that just as important, if not more important, because people who talk about ideas love to talk about ideas, but then someone has to go and enact them. So not only are simple ideas valuable, but simple ideas that are also cheap are extraordinarily valuable. So I'd like to give you 3 examples of what I think are good, simple, and relatively cheap ideas. And they span time and they span place a bit. I'll tell one story that is an Asian story, or began in Asia at least, one story that's a European story, began in Europe, and another story that's an American story. The first one begins in Europe, in Vienna, in the 1840s, where at the very best hospital of its day, the Vienna General Hospital, there was a terrible plague, you could call it. And this wasn't unique to the Vienna hospital. It happened all over the world at all the best hospitals and all the worst hospitals, and it was called puerperal fever, which is another way of saying childbed death. Women, when they had babies, would come into a hospital seemingly healthy, and soon after delivering their babies, they would die. And often, their babies would die. Now, the reason you come into a hospital usually is to not die. So imagine you're bringing people into your hospital to have a baby, and they're dying from something other than the reason they came in there in the first place. Not a good development. So if you're running one of these hospitals, you'd very much like to stop killing people who are coming to you just to have a baby, and not with some terrible disease to start with. Now, this disease had been around for a while, but it was quite mysterious, and doctors of the day had many theories as to what caused it. Interestingly, most of the theories blamed the women. Now, I'm sure you all know that at that time, all the doctors were men. Women were not allowed to become doctors. And these theories blamed the women. The theories went like something like this. One would be that they wore their corsets too tight, and somehow it squeezed their intestines and fecal matter got into the blood, and that's what caused their deaths. Or here's another theory that I loved. The male doctors posited that the women were so distraught emotionally by the notion of being seen naked by men that they just kind of died on the spot, okay? Not a particularly scientific explanation, but one that was real. So there were all these explanations. Also, the notion of foul air in the maternity wards. There was one about the wall coverings in the hospital were thought to be toxic somehow. And yet it was very strange because the doctors didn't die. The male interns didn't die. It was only the women who were giving birth, and then often their babies would die as well. In 1847, the death rate at one of the very best hospitals in the world, the death rate of the women was 1 in 6. Okay, 1 in 6 women who came in to have a baby, otherwise healthy women, would die of this childbed fever. That same year, there was a young doctor by the name of Ignaz Semmelweis. I don't know if his name is well known in India. I do know that, unfortunately, it is not well known in the United States. Do people know who Ignaz Semmelweis was? I see a few. Okay. 3%. It's better than nothing. Ignaz Semmelweis was a young doctor, very ambitious in a scientific way, and also very empathetic, and he hated the idea that these women were dying of no apparent cause, and he wanted to solve the riddle. For years and years, doctors had had theories like the ones I mentioned. All of those theories were absent one particular thing, which was data. None of them were, if they were measurable, they weren't measured. Dr. Semmelweis did something that, as an author of Freakonomics, is very near and dear to my heart. He collected data. He wanted to solve this mystery by using data, and he turned himself into a sort of data detective. And he began to say, here's a condition. What can I learn about it through looking at the data? He began to gather data on the death rates at his hospital and other places where women gave birth. He noticed something very unusual. If a woman in Vienna, let's say a poor woman, gave birth at home with a midwife, which was still common, or even on the street, it turns out that she had a better chance of living than if she came to the best hospital in Vienna. So he thinks this is unusual and dispiriting, the fact that women do better on the street than they do in our best hospital. Then he decided to look at something that was unique to his hospital, which is that it had two separate wards. One where the male doctors and their interns delivered babies, and the other ward, or the other birth clinic, where the babies were delivered by midwives, female midwives, because again, women were not allowed to become doctors. They were allowed, however, to deliver babies. So while the male doctors were over here training their male students, and then they would come up and do deliveries, the women were over here doing deliveries as well. Now, he looked at the death rate for the two wards, and he found out that the death rate in the male doctor-delivered hospital ward was 3 times higher than where the midwives were delivering them. Amazing. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, you would think that doctors would be better because they're doctors. On the other hand, you might say, well, midwives are specialized, and that's all they do is deliver babies, so maybe that's why it is. But nevertheless, a rate of 3 times is worth doing something about. Then he backed up a little bit more. He wanted to look at how the women, so then he thought, well, maybe the women who come in to give birth in the doctor's wards, maybe they're sick to start with, and that's why they go to the doctor's ward, right? This is what social scientists call selection. You want to make sure there's no selection bias. If I'm trying to measure something, I want to make sure that I'm measuring equally. So as it turns out, this hospital had a very interesting assignment methodology, which was they randomly assigned patients to the male or female ward depending on the day of the week. So if you came in on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you'd go to the male ward, where the male doctors were. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and so on, you go to the other one. So it was almost like a randomized controlled trial, like in a medical trial. So we thought, well, it's not because the patients that the doctors are getting are sicker in any way. It must be something to do with the doctors. But what? These were the best trained doctors in the world. What could it be? Kept gathering data, kept trying to think it through, kept trying to look for incentives to try to figure out what was happening where. And then something terrible happened, which was a mentor of his died after an accident in the autopsy ward. This was an elder doctor whose finger was sliced open by a student. And within a few days, this mentor of Semmelweis's had died. What the male doctors usually did, their research during this time, was by conducting autopsies. Autopsy was the peak medical science of the day because you could really figure out what had happened to a body. And so they would do their autopsies, and then when the call came that a mother was ready to go, they would come up there to the ward. And Semmelweis realized at this moment, the thing that killed his mentor, which was cadaverous particles, something from the cadaver that they were operating on, had gotten into his bloodstream and killed him. Well, could it be possible that the same thing was happening when the male doctors would rush up to the delivery ward and deliver babies, having come from conducting an autopsy? And of course the answer is yes. And the problem was, this was pre-germ theory. No one thought that something microbial and alive, like a germ, could cause an illness and even kill a mother and child. And therefore, the male doctors, after conducting an autopsy, they didn't wash their hands. They would do an autopsy, do this, and then go deliver a baby. So Semmelweis said, what if we could institute a policy here at the hospital whereby the doctors, after conducting an autopsy and before going to deliver a baby, rinse their hands in an antiseptic chlorinated water wash? And they did. And within a week, the death rate in that ward had gone from over 16% to less than 1%. because one person figured out the way something worked, because one person went to the trouble to gather data and think through the process that was going on, he saved just that 1 year in that one ward about 300 lives. And then you multiply that forward many years, many hospitals, and you see one simple idea saved millions of lives, more than just about anything else we can think of in medical terms. Nice work on a simple and extremely cheap idea. The next idea that came about began in the Philippines, on the island of Luzon, at a mountain called Mount Pinatubo. I gather you all know what Mount Pinatubo did in 1991. Yes, in the States, people have not heard of Mount Pinatubo. In 1991, Mount Pinatubo, which was a kind of old, scraggly, worn-down, eroded, friendly mountain, began to shake and rumble and spew ash and gas, and it turns out that it was a long, dormant volcano. And scientists rushed to it from around the world to see what they could learn, and they learned that it had exploded not recently at all. 5,000 years, I believe, was the most recent explosion, but it seemed like it was a pretty bad one. They tried to warn everybody to get out of the way, that this could be a bad one, and they actually did a very, very good job of evacuating most people in the area. When it blew, it really blew. For 9 hours straight, Mount Pinatubo erupted. It was the most forceful volcanic eruption of the past 100 years. Okay? It shot its sulfuric ash 20 miles into the sky. Okay? So think about the force that a volcano has to generate to shoot its ash 20 miles up. About 250 people died in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, mostly because there was a hurricane in the region at the same time. The ash mixed with the hurricane dropped down buckets of heavy, wet ash and hailstones on houses. Their roofs collapsed. That's how mostly they died. If it hadn't been for that hurricane, which was a freak event, the deaths would have been much lower. Some died afterwards in mudslides as well, but generally, the deaths were, considering the force of this volcano, were pretty low. Now, what happens when you have the biggest volcano in 100 years? Well, 100 years earlier, the last big one, the scientists, there weren't as many scientists who studied this, and they didn't have as good data measurement tools. This time, 1991, a lot of scientists came. They looked at all aspects of the aftermath of the volcano, and they found something very interesting. They found two interesting things. One, nice and innocuous. Around the world, for the next couple years, the sunsets were beautiful. They were red, they were orange, they were yellow, because there was all this haze in the stratosphere. But something else they found that was even more interesting, which was that the Earth cooled for the next couple years, on average by about 0.5 degree Celsius, or about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And in some places, the degree of cooling was even greater. If you look at the degree, the amount of temperature change over the past 100 years, due to what is thought to be man-made global warming, it's a little over 1 degree Celsius, which was about the maximum that the Earth cooled after Mount Pinatubo, which is to say that one volcanic explosion seemed to reverse, albeit temporarily, reverse 100 years of warming. How did it do that? When you put sulfur into the air at a low level, let's say a coal-burning power plant, it's in the troposphere, which is where we breathe, and it comes right back on us in the form of acid rain, and it is not good. When you put it into the stratosphere, which starts 6 miles up, it goes up, it becomes a part of a kind of shield, in this case, around the Earth, and essentially that sulfuric haze prevented some of the sun coming in and cooled the Earth. Okay? Now, you might think, well, this is a neat accident, although it's a very high price to pay. You've got a volcano going off. And if you want to stop global warming, or stop the effect, at least, of global warming, it's kind of tricky to program a volcano to go off. Some scientists actually did the measurements. They say, if we could program a volcano of Pinatubo's size, how often would it have to go off to reverse global warming? And they did their best calculations, and it turns out that if you could blow up a Pinatubo every 2 years, one Pinatubo every 2 years, you could stop global warming, not just what it is now, but what's expected to be about 100 years from now. Now, we are a smart group of people, especially in this room, extremely esteemed people in many, many areas. But even if there are those among you who know how to blow up a volcano, we probably don't want to try it. It's a little bit iffy, okay? It's not very controllable. But what would happen if you could replicate the effect of Pinatubo? There is a company that we'll be writing about in our next book that I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about in coming years. And they've done some thinking along these lines. This is a company that comes up with inventions. They are an invention company. Some of their inventions are phenomenally weird. They want to stop malaria not by giving vaccines, not by mosquito nets. They want to stop malaria by programming a laser gun to target the species of female mosquitoes that carry malaria, and only those mosquitoes. And once the laser has identified them, and they identify those mosquitoes by wing beat, because female mosquitoes flap faster because they're lighter than males, and then they selectively assassinate malarial mosquitoes, okay? They have another invention that if there are any neurosurgeons in the room, I'm sure you can appreciate. They can generate a 3D model of a brain aneurysm based on the data that a neurosurgeon can glean, so that the neurosurgeon can prepare for surgery by seeing what the actual aneurysm is. This same company, also inspired by Pinatubo, has the idea to essentially run a kind of garden hose to the sky with a series of hot air balloons, essentially. This is the most simplistic form, that could spray sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere at the proper intervals and amounts that would essentially protect the Earth from the effects of global warming. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need to mitigate output, right? It doesn't mean you don't want to produce less carbon dioxide and methane and so on, but if the problem is that global warming is potentially dangerous and perhaps catastrophic, wouldn't it be a nice, cheap, and simple solution if you could essentially introduce a chemical, this is called geoengineering, to reverse that process, albeit imperfectly, albeit temporarily, but it could work. And the price tag would be about $200 million. Now, that sounds like a lot of money to any of, maybe not any of us. I don't know, Infosys. Yeah, that's true, given the market. So you could go in half with them, maybe. But for $200 million is the budget for this project. Now, there are a lot of caveats, which I don't have time to get into here, but here's what's interesting. Al Gore, who's a very admirable man on many levels, is currently spending about $300 million on a public relations campaign in the US called the We campaign, which is essentially meant to inspire behavior change. We've heard a lot about behavior change today, especially at the wonderful panel earlier on the youth and change. I'm here to be a little bit cynical and tell you that behavior change is great in theory and incredibly hard in fact. For instance, after Semmelweis, we've known that doctors should wash their hands after every patient contact, and yet one of the biggest causes of patient death in hospitals today still is bacterial infection passed on by doctors who still don't properly wash their hands. Behavior change is hard. Al Gore spending $300 million to ask people nicely to use fewer plastic bags. That's a behavior change. To hang up clothes instead of use a dryer. That's behavior change. To turn down the air conditioner. That's behavior change. But, and you may hate me for this and think I'm a Dr. Evil advocate, but the fact is that for less than that, a geoengineering solution may exist that could obviate the need for certain behavior changes, which are probably impossible anyway. I'll tell you one more. I want to finish and get to our other excellent speakers, or our excellent speakers. I don't mean to call myself one of the excellent speakers. This one concerned tax policy in the United States. Several years back, almost 20 years ago, the Treasury was very hard up for money, as our Treasury often gets. And what happens then is they figure, what can we do to bring in some more money? And sometimes they go to the IRS and say, can you get some more money from the taxpayers without it looking like we're the ones who are making you do it, you know? The IRS does not write tax law in the US. They just collect and punish and so on. There was a researcher at the IRS named John Szilagyi who'd had an idea years earlier, but it was shot down because it was thought to be too invasive somehow. But now they were desperate, and they said, Szilagyi, bring that idea back. What is it? Tell us what it is. It's very simple. On the tax form, the 1040 tax form, there's a line for each of your children. If you want to claim your child as a deduction, get a whole bunch of money off your taxes, you just fill in your child's name. That's all you had to do, okay? Szilagyi's idea was very simple. He said he suspected that there were divorced couples who were double claiming their children unknowingly. That there was a husband who was claiming the children and a wife who was claiming the children, and that the IRS was getting cheated out of those dollars. He said, it might not be much, but we'll gather in those extra dollars and it will help. So his change was this, very simple, very cheap. He required, instead of just writing in the name of your child, you had to write in their social security number, their national ID number, essentially. And he figured then they could cross-reference between tax returns. On April 15th, the night that returns are due, of 1987, suddenly, 7 million children vanished from America's tax rolls. 7 million children who had been claimed as deductions a year earlier were gone. 7 million, far more than could possibly have existed from double claiming divorced couples. Then John Szilagyi went and he looked at the names of some of these children who had been there in years previous and were gone. They had very unusual names. Names like Fluffy and Fido and Tampico, pet names, made up. People were just making, because the incentive to cheat was so strong, because it was just so easy, that people did. That one simple, cheap solution netted the IRS $4 billion in 1 year. One final word. Cheap solutions, simple solutions, I'm in favor of. Behavior change, as I've said, is very hard. But the last piece of this is incentives. We must give people incentives to have these solutions, and we must be incentivized ourselves. John Szilagyi, he came up with $4 billion for the U.S. Treasury. They didn't want to give him even a pat on the back. He finally wrote to his congressman. They gave him a little plaque years after the fact, and finally they gave him a bonus check of $25,000. Now, most of you are employers. I hope you incentivize your employees better than the IRS did, because if you want changes and you want ideas that can change the world and are simple and are cheap, people need to be incentivized more than for a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the gain that they produce. I thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you.
It is on. It's not working.
Okay. There's a handout coming along that for those of you that would like to play along, you can. And when there's a white space, we're actually asking if you're interested to write what you think the answers are. This question we have done in Washington, D.C., in Minneapolis, in Denmark, and in Strasbourg, and the answers are always somewhat different. And so it'd be very interesting during the dinner tonight to see what your answers, in fact, might be. But the real question, again, is what ideas could truly inspire a global community today? In 1997, Voyager 1 was leaving our solar system, and an astronomer, Carl Sagan, basically asked for the cameras to be turned backwards towards where it had come from. And the picture that was taken inspired him to reflect on our place in the universe. It was called the pale blue dot. And just a couple things from that. Look again. That dot, that's here. That's home. Everyone you've ever known has lived there. Every sinner and every saint in history, every species on this planet have lived on this pale mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Another scientist also is a challenge, but he was reflecting on the human condition, and he said that all the problems we have in the world today were generated by one type of thinking, and you don't solve those problems with the same type of thinking. That's very provocative. What is that type of thinking? What is that type of thinking for a species that has Stone Age motivations, with space-age technology, living on a bioeconomics planet? My work as an architect is the relationship between people and the environment. The challenges that we're going to be talking about here, the 5 great challenges, really come from that intersection of human needs and the natural environment. So I'm going to take you on a brief history back through time to see what that type of thinking comes from. Less than 50,000 years ago, our prehistoric ancestors struggled to survive in a very dangerous, competitive environment where we were not the strongest, we're not the fastest. Number one, if you want to play along with this, imagine yourself as that Stone Age person, and you're wet, you're cold, you're hungry, it's dark, you do not have fire, and there's noises and screeches from unseen animals at night. Fear factor. Number one, our ancestors were naturally afraid of the dark. The other is the unknown. Contemporary form is that we're also afraid of change and denial. Fear is a natural response to danger, though. They also learned that the tribe was more successful than the individual. In fact, the group that you were born into, we gave our undying love and support and loyalty to protect our own. At the same time, we were taught to be wary of the stranger. And oftentimes we treat the stranger with an expression of contempt, rejection, and even hostility. Challenge number two is control and dominance. Growing directly out of the fear instinct, if they could gain some control of their surroundings, they could also achieve a sense of safety. They, like us, were willing to abrogate a certain measure of security for predictability. It's a short step for those who provide the protection to also dominate the protected. Over the centuries, we have seen this pattern of decline of superpowers who drive to also dominate, and it's recorded in stone and soil time and time again. What happens with that domination, it leads to a privileged few, extravagant expending, internal political strife, endless warfare, excessive soil, and deforestation. What do you think our electronic recordings will say? Next one is kind of interesting, glitter factor. Not only did we have to respond to danger, but the quicker the better. The ability to see light on water, the splash of a fish, the movement of an animal was often part of a react-or-die event. If you had success at hunting and you survived that event, it was usually followed by costumes, ritual dancing, and celebrating around a fire. Today, glitter factor takes on the form of celebration of the hunter, the warrior, and the agility of the athlete. And we now respond to jewelry, shiny cars, entertainment, bright lights, movie stars, red carpets, trophies, parades, fireworks, electronic gadgets, and what's new. Because for our ancestors, the change between 3000 BC and 2000 BC was not great. And we never developed a very strong sense of farsightedness. And our lives are also short. Challenge number 4. Our Stone Age brothers were continuous struggle to find water, food, and shelter. And if you could provide these for your tribe, you were held in high esteem. Not only that, but you had your selection of the best mates. And also the reverse is true. And over time, it became so embedded in our psyche that we have to have productivity, we have to feel worth, we need work. And a social scientist, Abraham Maslow, created a simple diagram which he said that these are the things you have to achieve in order, starting out with air, food, and water, and then the security we're talking about for the environment and against others. But then there's self-love, and we know psychologically that you can't love somebody else if you don't love yourself first, and on to having community. But you notice there's a gap. And this is a very important gap between the idea of security and self-love. It's work. We have never found a substitution for people having purposes and being able not to complete the rest of the triangle. Challenge number 5. The Greek definition of economics is the rule of thumb of estate management. And I think it's important to talk about biology because nature is only economics. It basically has no waste. It always achieves the maximum from the minimum. And when Gary was asking before, what's a fact? Here's a fact. First of all, bioeconomics explains the biosphere of the planet which we share with everybody. It always creates life from the most abundant, which is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. It's powered by solar energy, and if you want the simple version of it, it has to collect energy from the sun. We get a solar profit every day. And the green plants are the only thing that creates life on this planet because it converts it. And in that conversion, you've now created the carrying capacity of the planet because through that production of sugar, it now feeds herbivores, and after that, just a few carnivores. But running through the whole system is one of the small things that Stephen talked about, are enzymes. On our planet, half of the enzymes are builders like we are. They collect energy, they make value added, and they produce what we would call wealth. The other half of the enzymes of this planet are the decomposers. They follow the first and second law of thermodynamics and basically break that elements down into a smaller capacity to regenerate the cycle, to recreate growth. That's the way the system works. Let's take a look at human economics placed on top of bioeconomics. The classic strategy is supply and demand tempered by the cost of labor and the cost of capital and resources. What's missing is the bio-human factors, environmental factors. To our ancient eyes, the environment was vast, easy and free to absorb any waste that we had produced. Today, people always ask, well, why does green cost more? It costs more simply because it's getting closer to the real cost. But we've always used future generations and the biosphere to subsidize our actions. Now the accumulated debt comes due. And it comes due in the forms of pollution, health problems, contaminated fish, ocean dead zones, water shortage, depleted resources, endangered species, global warming, and the price will continue to rise until we pay this debt. Because if the environment fails, we fail. If the environment fails, we fail. We need to rethink our estate management. The instincts that we evolved in those first environments, which helped us not only to survive, but to thrive, may in fact now be working against us in the environment we've created. So the 5 great ideas are going to be in response to these 5 challenges, which hopefully you've answered some of those. Fear and caution, control and dominance, glitter and response, work and worth, and environment of bioeconomics. Let's take a look at that intersection between the environment and human needs. The rainforest is nature's most complex symbiotic environment. The city is humans' most complex and interdependent creation. 50% of all the species on the planet live in the rainforest. 50% of all of us live in cities. The rainforest occupies about 3% of the land mass on the planet. Cities occupy about 3% of the land mass on the planet. Given the same inputs, however, of sun, rain, and soil, the rainforest, which has poor soil to begin with, must maintain itself. It has actually a little fungus, one of those decomposers, that rapidly recycles the leaf fall. It takes that up, and because of transpiration, it actually drives its own rainfall. It produces 75% of its own rain. The city, on the other hand, having sun, rain, and soil, we import 75% of the resources to sustain our urban environments. The output of the environment of the rainforest is rich, a balanced habitat, has vast biodiversity for plants and animals, no waste. Key thing, no waste. Produces oxygen, sequesters CO2 for the planet. The city, on the other hand, is our human habitat. It produces jobs, technology, creativity, culture, but it also produces sewage, contaminated water, garbage, landfills, and we're polluting the planet. The rainforest uses a concept called local sustainability. The city, as the Romans and every system we've had before, is wasting away. Great ideas. I want you to look at the, not the word there, but the icon. As artists, architects, appreciators of the environment, we walk around the park and we appreciate the park, but we only see the top level. We think in 2 dimensions. The third dimension is the other half of those enzymes that make the world that we exist in. As social beings, we migrate to the city. So idea number 1 is a green transformer zone. We migrate because of work, education, culture, and excitement. Cities will continue to grow and put even more stress on outdated infrastructure. The city is a technological trap without an insurance program. If any part of the infrastructure fails, whether it be food delivery, electricity, garbage, sewer removal, treatment, fresh water, the environment becomes uninhabitable for modern city dwellers. Here's an example done by Ebenezer Howard in the turn of the 19th century. And it was called a green belt that surrounded a city. And the reason it was important is even at that point, they wanted to control sprawl. He also felt that it was important that the urban dwellers have a break from the dense city core. Positive also was it would shorten the distance of providing food to the city and longer and less travel sort of things. So here's a model. This one is done in Israel. There is the dense urban core that we like. It's for about 100,000 people. There's the workspaces that relate to it, and then there's the surrounding green fields. Here's another green transformer zone, but it's only 2-dimensional. This is Central Park in New York, and everybody goes there for all the reasons that Ebenezer Howard talked about of the stress from the city. You will never see a developer ever make a proposal to build a building in the middle of that park. But also, you don't find that park going outside the boundaries of it. Here's a better model of what a green transformer zone might look like. This one is Back Bay of Boston, but what you're seeing there is you're seeing the fabric of maybe water filtration, you're seeing recreation, you're seeing community gardens, urban forest parks, and all surrounding the sides would be businesses and support strategies, and it's beginning to fit the fabric of the city. So, idea number 1 relates to, because the city is never done, it gives us the opportunity to replace obsolete, or in other countries, non-existent utilities with green transforming and structures, which would, 1, change pollution to fresh air, gray water to irrigation, sewage to soil, gardens to food, garbage to goods, sprawl to planning, and parks and recreations to jobs. Well, how can we do that? Nature does it. It's had 300 million years to solve it. It gives us the answers. Idea number 2 comes from the idea of addressing the human need for work. The concept of the green zone must measure not only environmental successes, but humans as well by providing high and low-tech jobs and training opportunities. Let's take a look at Maslow, but let's complete the rest of the triangle. If you take a look at the air, food, and water, that's the bioeconomy. That's what the planet does by itself, or if we ate it with agriculture. And if you complete the rest of his triangle after work, at the very top, it is art, science, and spirituality. And they all say the same thing. We can be better than we are. That's the positive side. That's the hopeful side of his triangle. We also then traded and said, let's do the negative side. What does that look like? You can have despair, unemployment. Then after that, you have the idea of poverty, diseases, crime. Eventually, you get down to environmental degrading, easy recruiting for military, and militarism, an endless war strategy. Which side of the triangle do we want to live on? Which side are we moving in terms of it? Here's some examples of high tech. Look at the old tech and the new tech. Here's an example in the work zone, which is just biotech. We don't have to do anything. This is what stagnant water does any place in the world, and it produces this particular transformer, which can be farmed, can be made into fuel, and also into fertilizer. The other part that everything we see sitting on these tables here is this horrendous amount of waste, which we need the best of ingenuity to turn products. Do you realize that there's an island floating in the oceans that is twice the size of Texas, made up of that? And it's growing, it's not shrinking. So, creative networks, idea number 3. This responds to the glitter factor. Like our prehistoric ancestors, we respond to motion, light, and sound and respond to instant feedback. Today, we enjoy movies, video games, electronic communication, social networks. For the first time in history, we have the opportunity of creating a global brain between any of us, not just a special few. The enterprise zone would also be a direct open source electronic link to each other. Simple communications globally to any one of these enterprise zones would be, here's what we're working on. We're having some problems here. What are you doing? We could do these sort of things. The other component is necessary is an environmental stock exchange. The same as the military has for war rooms. If you cannot measure it, you cannot change it. Some economists right now are working on analyzing the biosphere to find out its contribution to the global intrinsic value. And they've taken different zones like rainforest, wetlands, and oceans, and the result that they've calculated is about $33 trillion in 1997 per hectare, 2 times the global national GNP. There are websites on your handouts there, so you can check some of these numbers on your own and from the people who are doing this work. The global zone of work and communications takes on a factor of the natural. It must be this icon of this wonderful garden. It has to have the high electronics, and it must have the schools for training. And here's what this would report. Success, positive and gains. It would have net losses in terms of rainforest, biodiversity, glacial melt, fresh water. The projections of short and long-term options, climate analysis, new jobs and business opportunities, plus current business ratings, negative impact, shades of green, sustainability, restorative. This will help us make informed decisions, not intuitive decisions, knee-jerk decisions. In the past, civilizations have always collapsed in isolation. Today, isolation no longer exists. The World Bank has identified 35 fragile nation states where the central government has lost control of the ability to provide the most simple, basic infrastructure utilities, the very thing we're talking about. The results are warring factions vying for power, conflicts spilling over national borders. Failed nation states have huge environmental impacts in the form of soil, in terms of contaminated water, and a number of things. Well, what we need today is idea number 4, a global leadership. Leadership has to rise to meet the challenge of change with broad experiences, creativity, compassion to address global problems without boundaries. Global problems without boundaries. To understand that we're all the same tribe. Okay. So any person in any country with leadership potential can become a candidate as a global citizen. And you'd need to fill some simple requirements. You'd have to work in 3 countries, a minimum of 1 year, educate in 3 countries. You'd have to be conversant in 3 languages, and work in 4 underdeveloped countries, and work in a green transformer zone. Here are some experiments that are being done with leadership right now. This is Dubai, and it has some qualities of the way it's designed, which has a major street down the center. You can go skiing in the desert. My master teacher, Lou Kahn, said, you always must search for form, not shape. Shape is your artistic interpretation. Form is the underlying truth. You can never argue with that. It's breathtaking. From the sky, you see this wonderful palm leaf. If you look at the real shape as compared to its form, there's some fatal flaws here. Here's another example. This is Mastar. This one has 0 waste, and it has no carbon footprint and no automobiles in the center city. The strategy here is a palm leaf. If you look at the top, you see collection from the solar collectors. It creates shade underneath. It collects the rainwater. It cycles down. It supports the oasis underneath, and it actually uses a solar chimney to drive ventilation all the way through. Here's a rural example. This is in Denmark, in this island of Samso, which is zero carbon footprint, high tech, low tech, and they have a school. You can go right there, take classes, and complete the rest of your global citizenship. The 5 great ideas for funding. Funding is essential. And the concept here is preemptive peace. Preemptive peace means that we can make peace with each other by making peace through the planet. There's 650 billion of us. $1.2 trillion is spent per year on global military expenditures. Half of it comes from my country. About 300 million people, including the soldiers, the industries, and the support industries behind that, are the ones who basically use this. My argument is that some people actually profit from the idea of war and conflict. The 6.5 billion people can no longer afford the economics of the 300 billion. So in the end, what we're looking at is that this ideas comes from the next evolution of working with the biosphere, where the green transformer zone is a modern transferable infrastructure, where buildings generate their own energy, they consume their own waste, where waste is seen as a resource for regenerating wealth. Training centers for both high-tech and low-tech jobs, a creative enterprise zone for venture capital and new businesses, a place where future leaders can be educated, industry and politics, and become global citizens, and part of the military know-how can be applied to preemptive peace. The idea of the question is change. The ideas change the world. The ideas have brought us to the world we're at. We need a new set to take us into the next level. The idea of challenge, though, is a little bit more provocative. This is another environment being built in Saudi Arabia, where it's an international biological garden where the visitors can experience 400 million years of plant growth. But the genius of it is it ends in 2 alternative gardens for the future. The first one is barren. The second one is lush and biodiversity. The challenge of change is more about leadership, the ability to choose wisely and make peace with the planet. And so we end where we began, with Carl Sagan. He said, "Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic darkness. In our obscurity and all this vastness, there is no hint that help is coming from anywhere else to save us from ourselves. It is perhaps no better demonstration of the human folly and conceit that this distant image of our tiny world, to me, underscores the responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known." Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very good to be here, to be home in India. I first came to India in 1998 to become the daughter-in-law to a wonderful Indian family, and I haven't regretted for a single day. When my twin identical girls were born in the US, I wanted to give them English first names. You know, being a Chinese, most of my Chinese friends have adopted English first names. My husband, being a proud and stubborn Indian, threatened over my dead body. That was not very persuasive. But then he strategized. He said that, look, when our girls grew up, 20 years from today, what would the world look like? Having a combined Chinese and Indian first names is a competitive advantage. And that, to the ears of a very pragmatic Chinese, is music. It's Bollywood music. When I look at the world, I see the 3 biggest forces reshaping the global landscape as the rise of China, the rise of India, and the ongoing technological revolution. Now, here being with an Indian audience, on stage with an IT legend, I thought I would focus my talk on China to talk about what's going on in China and some of the major shifts that China is taking place or must take place. I see four major shifts. The first is the shift from being export-oriented to being more domestic consumption-oriented. Just exactly how dependent is China's economy on export? Now, if you look at the top-line figures, China's export is about 35% of China's GDP. But remember, GDP is the value-added sum. And if you take the value-added portion of China's export, that is about 1/3, because China does a lot of processing trade, and 1/3 of 35% is 12%. And that 12% has been growing at about averaging 25 to 27%. And you do the math, and you know that 12% of 27% is about 3%, meaning that the export growth contributed to about 3% to China's GDP growth. In 2008, of the 9% GDP growth, 4.2% comes from the investment, 4% from consumption, 0.8% comes from export. Now, as China's GDP grows, as the economy gathers bulk, the living standard will improve, the middle class will grow bigger, domestic consumption will have to happen. China needs it, the world needs it, and it wants it. If you look at China's export today, it is 10% of the world's export, and that export has been growing at 25% versus 10% for the world's export. Now, if you let that rate continue, that means that by 2020, China's share of the world's export could be close to 40%. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. No economy is going to commit suicide to let that happen. And that means that China will have to depend more on domestic consumption. And Chinese government is realizing that. And if you look at the measures that have been taking place or announced in the last 4 months, I'm encouraged to see some very, very good encouraging signs. For example, the November 2008 $600 billion US dollar stimulus plan, of course, it includes 45% of that on general infrastructure. On top of that, $45 billion is put into rural infrastructure. Another measure that's been announced, that is to give consumption coupons to the farmers to buy home appliances products and PCs, etc. Another measure to build affordable housing. Another one to build vast network of logistics centers, to build rural retail stores, to encourage the flow of agricultural products to the cities and the manufactured products to the countryside. Now, people save to cover rainy days. A very important piece is the healthcare. Just in February this year, China announced a $125 billion plan to reform the healthcare to make universal healthcare a realistic reality by 2011. Now, all of these point out to the shift, gradual shift towards becoming more domestic consumption oriented. The second shift, as I see, or I think China must undertake, is from being an imitator to an innovator. Now, the Chinese are innovative imitators, and back when the "Who Moved My Cheese" was a top seller, shortly afterwards in the Chinese market, you found "Who Stole My Cheese" and "Who Moved My Dumplings." Just a few months ago, my older sister bought my girls some very nice shirts, with a rabbit logo, which is identical to the Playboy logo, a cute rabbit, but of course they had no idea. But being a Chinese, I may say this with probably a straight face that not a lot of Chinese view piracy as shameful. But let's admit that imitation often is the first step towards innovation. As the Haier CEO once said, that first we observe and digest, then we imitate. By the time that we really got it, then we design independently. And design they did, including washing machines to wash sweet potatoes. Very, very useful for the farmers, not for you folks, but very useful nonetheless. Now, if you look at the facts, China's R&D to GDP ratio in 2005 was about 1.5%. And the goal was to take it up to 2.5% of the GDP. And that's the ratio for the developed economies. From the input front, we know that China and India produce the largest number of engineers, masters, and PhDs. On the ground, low purchasing power, environmental degradation, shortage of energy, these created astute demand for companies, any companies, domestic or foreign companies, to come up with innovative solutions to address these issues. And if you look at the output front, just based on the patent granted by the US Patent Office, the China-origined patents from 2004 to 2007 has grown up by 27%, as compared to almost 0% for almost all of the grants granted, patents granted. So you have to prove, and you also have the necessity for Chinese to innovate. Now, the third shift, I think, must happen is happening towards that, is moving from fragmentation to consolidation. Over the last few decades of single-mindedly pursuing GDP, China's many industries are very fragmented. Now, every province wants to build factories in their own turf, and Chinese government realized that they have to pursue consolidation that has been going on for a while, and now it's gathering speed. If you look at some of the examples in the auto industry, 2005, 150 OEMs, now 45. Now, Chinese government thinks that's still quite fragmented as compared to the developed economies, so the goal is to consolidate. You look at cement industry. China is the #1 cement producer, but with 5,000 cement factories. India, the #2 biggest cement producers, the top 5 producer occupies close to half of the market share versus top 10 Chinese producers only having a 14% market share. And if you look at the steel industry, the government wants to consolidate 1,000 steel mills down to 100. In February, the plan was announced to engineer the mergers and acquisitions to create 4 big steel giants, each with a capacity of close to 40 to 50 million tons, essentially making them 4 of the 5 largest steel mills right behind ArcelorMittal in the world. Or you look at the shipbuilding industry. February, the plan was announced to build 3 large shipbuilding bases, one in the north, one near Shanghai, and one in the south. And energy sector, the same story. So consolidation is and needs to happen. Now, why so? Why this urge to consolidate amidst the global slowdown? Now, there are 4 reasons. One is reduced overcapacity. If you look at the steel industry, China in 2008 consumed 450 million tons. Now the capacity is 660 million tons. So there is this overcapacity issue. And 2, despite the global slowdown and the effect on China, China needs to continue to pursue sustainable development to reduce pollution, to become more energy efficient. So closing down of some of the smaller mills helps that. And the third, China's industries, especially heavy industries, depend on raw materials from foreign countries. Consolidated industries will help to increase bargaining power vis-a-vis the more consolidated foreign raw material suppliers. And the fourth is the need to create big and strong domestic players. Now that leads me to talk about the 4th shift. That is the shift from domestic champions to global champions. China today has about 29 enterprises in the global Fortune 500 list. What about 2025, 2050? Could there be 75, 100? companies in the list? Possible. Now, Chinese companies going global still face major challenges, primarily in their managerial capabilities in several domains: corporate finance, the art and science of differentiation, learning how to integrate post-merger, the ability to manage horizontal organizations, because Chinese, being a command and control economy, our DNA is to manage vertical organizations, and the challenge of managing across diversities, and of course the challenge of English is a big challenge. But the Chinese are eager learners, and they are learning by taking small stakes, invest in foreign companies, but with a small stake, and gradually learn. And they invest right now in natural resources companies, such as Shinako's $19 billion bid for Rio Tinto, and my old employer, Minmetal's bid for Australia's OZ minerals. Now, as I look at these things happening in China, you can see kind of this pattern of crossing the river by feeling the stones, and crossing the rivers by feeling the stones is a concept, an idea proposed by Deng Xiaoping, and that simple idea has really unleashed unprecedented entrepreneurial energy. And it is with this energy that China will continue to experiment with building a socialist China or capitalist China with Chinese characteristics. Now, all of these, how does it matter to you? If you are an iron ore company, you may find that the counterpart sitting across you now has gathered more bargaining power. If you are an IT service company, maybe you will find opportunities in helping those newly consolidated companies to integrate through a common IT platform. If you are an IT training company, you may find that the government encourages you to provide IT training services to those unemployed. If you are an infrastructure finance company, maybe you can lead a syndicate that includes the Chinese money, the Middle East money, to finance the infrastructure in India. If you are in no business and in search for new business, maybe you will look in the China and India corridor and find new business. As I said in the beginning, that when China and India get together, beautiful things could happen. And that's what I believe in. The rise of China and the rise of India is by itself transformational story, but the real stories is in the increasing integration between the two powerful economies, and just imagine the compound power of the two. And as we said in our new book, Getting China and India Right, think China and India, not China or India. I thank you very much for your listening.